How does a sentence such as, I have got to go to the store after work, become, I've got to go to the store after work? Listen to that again. I have got to go to the store after work. I've got to go to the store after work. The answer is reductions. Reductions or reduced speech is when an English speaker shortens or eliminates a particular sound. This can occur in the form of reduced sounds, connected speech, and contractions. In this lesson today, you're going to learn 4 common examples of reductions in American pronunciation so that you can better understand fast English speakers in conversations, podcasts, TV shows, and so on. You'll also be able to use these reductions in your conversations for natural sounding speech. If you don't already know, I'm Anne-Marie with Speak Confident English. Everything I do is designed to help you get the confidence you want for your life and work in English. One way I do that is with my weekly Confident English lessons, where I share fluency and confidence building strategies, advanced level vocabulary, and pronunciation training, like in this lesson today. While you're here, make sure that you subscribe to the Speak Confident English channel so you never miss one of my lessons. Before we get into these 4 common examples of reductions in American pronunciation, I want to talk about fast English speakers. Because to be clear, there are 2 groups of fast English speakers. Let's talk about group number 1. In this group, you have English speakers who use natural pronunciation patterns, such as the reductions you're going to learn today. English speakers naturally blend, link, delete, change, and shorten sounds. This is all perfectly normal in our speech. However, if these pronunciation patterns are new to you, then it will sound as though an English speaker is talking quickly. And in fact, that is the purpose of reductions. They allow our speech to flow more smoothly. I want you to think about your mouth for a moment. There are so many muscles that are working to make all of the sounds we make in individual words and when we start to combine those words in sentences. Think for a moment about the muscles that you use to walk or ride a bike. What would it be like if in walking you kept one leg firmly planted on the ground, unmoving, while one leg is in motion? Your right leg is using its muscles to move forward. And then when you step forward, it stops. It's unmoving. And then you start to move the muscle group in your left leg. That's not a very efficient or smooth way of walking, is it? Instead, our muscles in both the right and the left legs are moving in overlapping motion constantly. They're happening simultaneously. That allows us to have a smooth cadence and to go from walking to jogging to running and sprinting. The same is true in our speech. We can learn words and sounds in isolation, like the word got. But the moment we start to introduce other words, the muscles in our mouth have to move differently in order to shift from one sound or one word to the next. So got with got and to become gotta. We could definitely continue to pronounce every word in isolation all the time, but that doesn't sound natural, and it is, in fact, quite slow. Using reductions allows for efficient, smooth, and fluent speech. Now let's talk about the second group. This group of fast English speakers still uses those natural pronunciation patterns, and they speak too fast. Here's what I mean. Let me give you an illustration of what it means to speak too fast. In other words, I'm never taking a breath or pausing or giving myself a moment to think or giving you any time to recognize the words I'm saying or to reflect on anything that I've said at all. In the end, I'm running out of breath, feeling a little bit exhausted and overwhelmed. You might be too. Do you feel a little bit whiplashed or overwhelmed with that? If you do, that's okay. You should. I didn't give you any chance to reflect or think on what I was saying, and I didn't give myself any moment to breathe. That was speaking too fast. And as my fluency school students know, that is not good communication. In fact, I would argue it's not even fluent speech. It is fast, to be sure. Fluency is flow and efficiency in speaking. When something is efficient, it's done well, and it's easy to understand. In other words, you are able to communicate smoothly, but you also maintain control over how fast you speak to ensure clarity. There's a big difference. In this lesson, we are going to focus most of our time on 4 common examples of reductions in American pronunciation. But I also want to help with what to do or how to better understand individuals that simply speak too fast. So I'll share some tips with you at the end. But let's move on to the first reduction we're going to focus on today, the word to. It's such a tiny little word, but we often reduce it in speech because it allows us to more easily transition from one sound to the next, and it smooths everything out. In sentences, you're unlikely to clearly hear the word to. Instead, you're going to hear ta or da. There are some specific patterns we follow for this. When the word to follows a word that ends in a consonant, we tend to say ta. For example, I've gotta go to the store. Lena gave us a great presentation to think about. To think about. I want you to give both of those a try. Listen carefully and then repeat after me. I gotta go to the store. Lena gave us a great presentation to think about. Now, I mentioned that sometimes the word to is reduced to da with a D sound. We do that when the word to follows a word that ends in a vowel. Here's an example. I need you to pick up the kids from school. I need you to pick up the kids from school. Listen again and repeat. I need you to pick up the kids from school. Again, I'm not saying to pick up the kids from school. It's you to pick up the kids from school. I need you to pick up the kids from school. Now, in that sentence, you may have noticed something else going on. I didn't say I need you to. I said I need you to. I need you to pick up the kids from school. We're using a reduced form with the word to, and there's something else going on with need and you. We call it assimilation, and I've got a lesson coming up on that in a few weeks, so be sure to keep an eye out for it. But for now, let's move on to our second reduction with the word of. Similar to how we reduce the word to. When the word of follows a word that ends in a consonant, the of becomes a. We completely eliminate that F sound, a. For example, you may hear a marketing manager say, most of the engagement we get is on Instagram. Listen again. Most of the engagement we get is on Instagram. Mosta is a reduced form of most of. But I'm not saying those words in isolation. You don't hear most of the engagement we get is on Instagram. Mosta. Most of the engagement we get is on Instagram. Here are a few more commonly reduced combinations using of. Kinda. I kinda like that movie. Sorta. Lotsa. I had lotsa email to answer this morning. A lotta. A great way to practice those examples is to think about how you would use them in your own sentences. Write those sentences down and then practice saying it out loud using the reduced form. It might help if you write the reduced form in your examples. And now let's move on to our third reduction with the words for and your. In reduced speech, we modify for to fur. Do you notice that slight difference in the vowel? Instead of for, fur. And we do the same thing with your. Let's look at some specific examples. Listen to how I use the word for in these sentences. It's for the hostess. It's for the hostess. It's for the hostess. The call's for you. The call's for you. Again, I'm not saying that clear for. I've reduced it to for. The call's for you. And here's an example with your. Could you send your estimate tomorrow? Could you send your estimate tomorrow? What time is your appointment? What time is your appointment? Give it a try. What time is your appointment? In those last two examples, if you listen carefully, you might notice that the R sound at the end of your carries over to the next word. Your estimate, your appointment. Do you notice that slight R sound on restimate, your restimate, your appointment? Let's give it one more try. Could you send your estimate tomorrow? What time is your appointment? Now that we've got two of, for, and your, let's look at some contractions. I have a more in-depth lesson on contractions, but I want to review them here because they are such an important part of natural sounding speech. If you'd like to get my full lesson on contractions, I will leave a link to that lesson in the video notes below. But let's look at a few that you definitely want to know. You're likely very familiar with contractions in the negative form using not. For example, don't, doesn't, won't, can't. But contractions I often hear my students struggle with include the word will. For example, I'll call him tomorrow. She'll see you now. He'll get back to you by the end of the week. When we combine the word will with a pronoun, it elongates the vowel sound and adds the sound ill at the end. I'll, she'll, he'll, they'll, will. Two more contractions that you want to be familiar with and that also require you to think carefully about the context. Use had and the modal would. Both of these words are contracted into the simple sound of d. For example, I'd. I had, I'd. I would, I'd. So how do you know the difference? Again, you have to think about the context of this sentence. Let me give you an example, and I want you to identify, am I using I had or I would? I'd just closed the door when I realized I locked my keys inside. What do you think? I'd just closed my door when I realized I locked my keys inside. Am I using I had just closed my door or I would just close my door? Of course, grammatically in that sentence, I had is the right choice. I had just closed the door when I realized I locked my keys inside. But in the contracted form, I'd just closed the door when I realized I locked my keys inside. Let's give it another try. I'm going to share with you a sentence, and I want you to evaluate whether we're using had or would. She'd like to go out tonight. Which one am I using? Am I saying she had like to go out tonight, or she would like to go out tonight? Which one makes more sense to you? Absolutely, in this one, it's she would. She'd like to go out tonight. At this point, you may be wondering, Anne-Marie, this seems like a lot of work. Is it really necessary? And I would argue that it is. At the very minimum, understanding these pronunciation patterns is going to allow you to understand English speakers so much more easily. And if you struggle with overall flow or fluency in your speech, using reduced forms can help smooth things along and create that natural sounding speech. It does require practice up front and getting comfortable with these sounds. Often when my students practice contractions, they think that they're saying them wrong or they feel weird and uncomfortable. That's perfectly normal. It does sound weird to go from can, not to can't. It's an odd sound. Similarly, it sounds strange to go from I will to I'll. However, it will allow for that smooth flow in your speech. There are a few more contractions I want to highlight for you because these are particularly unusual. You're likely to hear English speakers use gonna as opposed to going to. I'm gonna need more time. Similarly, want to becomes wanna. They wanna do a movie night on Friday. As you've learned, got to becomes gotta. I gotta go to the store. I've gotta take my daughter to her recital. Give me becomes gimme. Give me a second to think about it. Give me a second to think about it. And lastly, don't know becomes dunno. They don't know when the orders will arrive. One question I often get when I share these examples of connected speech is, Anne-Marie, can I use these in professional communication? Or perhaps you've learned that they're very informal, maybe even inappropriate pronunciation. The truth is, English speakers use these naturally, more than they even know. They are perfectly appropriate in everyday communication, including talking to your colleagues at work. Listen carefully to some of your coworkers, particularly if you work with native English speakers. You're going to hear these regularly. You'll also hear them in TV shows, movies, and podcasts. Now, when you want to be particularly careful with your speech, and in some instances more formal, for example, if you're giving a presentation or even in a job interview, you can certainly avoid some of these. However, you'll notice that others still use them. They are extremely common in everyday speech. And once again, like all reductions, these examples allow us to have that smooth flow when we speak. Yes, they tend to be more informal, but they're still used very often. So how can you start to practice reduced sounds in your speech? There are two great ways that I recommend. Number one, you can use a mirroring method. And number two, you can use a shadowing method. Now, these two methods often get used interchangeably, but there is a bit of a difference between the two, and both have their purpose. In mirroring, you would listen to an example that's shared. For example, listen to an example I share in this video. You would listen carefully, observe, and then stop the video and repeat what you heard. This is great for repeated practice with very specific sounds. For example, reductions. With shadowing, you listen and mimic what you hear. You speak while I'm speaking. It's almost simultaneous. And in shadowing, you're not just focused on one specific pronunciation pattern or sound. You're working on everything at the same time. Stress, intonation, and so on. Both of these methods are wonderful ways to practice your pronunciation. And you can use these as well with my in-depth training called How to Say What You Want in English. In that training, I offer strategies that allow you to develop confidence and express yourself more easily. It's a great way to incorporate a practice focusing on your pronunciation. Now that you have those 4 examples of reductions and a couple ways to practice, let's go back to the reality that there are some English speakers who use these pronunciation patterns and speak too fast. I've had many students who have struggled with coworkers or even bosses who never pause, who never take a moment to breathe while speaking, and it can be difficult to keep up and grasp all the details. So what do you do if you're not really comfortable asking them to slow down, or if you have asked them to slow down, but they still continue speaking in the same way? One thing that you can do is train your listening to understand individuals who speak faster. To do this, I recommend taking advantage of technology. For example, here on YouTube, you have settings for your videos, and you can increase the playback speed. I recommend finding a video with someone you understand easily, and then, rather than listening at normal speed, increase the playback speed just a bit. By doing so, you're going to eliminate those little pauses that allow you to reflect on what you've heard and to catch more details. You'll begin to sharpen your ability to understand individuals who speak too fast. You might notice that I keep saying individuals who speak too fast instead of using fast speakers. And there's a reason for that. I want to remind you that fluency is flow and efficiency, which means maintaining control and communicating clearly. There are individuals who speak far too quickly, and that doesn't mean they're good communicators. But it is important to recognize that there are many different communication styles, and you will encounter individuals who speak extremely fast in real life and on TV. With what you've learned today, you are well on your way to better understanding fast English speakers and using reductions in your communication for more natural sounding speech. If you enjoyed this lesson today, be sure to let me know. You can give it a thumbs up here on YouTube, and as I said, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.